The Council of Orbits closed the case with a single decision. The orbital elevator was declared dead. The planet was labeled inefficient. Evacuation was called mercy. Then human ships entered the disaster zone. They did not evacuate civilians. They deployed welding frames. Vacuum killed in seconds. Radiation killed in minutes. Every calculation said repair was impossible. Humans began welding metal in empty space. Not because they could, but because leaving mint cities below would suffocate and die. And in that moment, the galaxy learned that humanity does not accept reasonable retreat as an answer. The Council of Orbits consigned the planet to oblivion with the soft chime of closing files. Within crystalline chambers drifting above the gas giant S rings, light refracted through prismatic walls and broke into calm spectra, untroubled by the disaster unfolding below. The catastrophe had already been categorized, quantified, and archived beneath a designation that translated cleanly to terminal. The orbital elevator had snapped during a stellar shear, its upper kilometers torn apart and scattered into a lethal halo of alloy splinters and frozen vapor. The remains spun in silence, glinting like razors against the void. Without the tether, the planet was severed from its lifeline. Elevation ports went dark one by one as power grids stuttered. Reactors coughed and overheated, bleeding waste heat into failing exchangers. Cities drowned in the sour tang of recycled air pushed past exhaustion. Cargo schedules collapsed into red alerts as orbital traffic rerouted and then vanished entirely. From orbit, the world looked intact, blue and stubbornly alive. But the Council's instruments smelled decay in the numbers, heard it in the jitter of oscillating graphs. The Council's logic unfolded with flawless efficiency. Evacuation demanded fewer ships than reconstruction, fewer lives than defiance. Repair timelines extended beyond acceptable risk envelopes. The elevator, once broken, could not be trusted again. The vacuum had claimed it, and the vacuum did not relinquish what it had taken. Orders propagated through relay after relay with antiseptic calm. Priority corridors were assigned. Quarantine perimeters sketched themselves into place like chalk lines around a corpse. From the alien perspective, this was not cruelty but arithmetic. Structures that failed under stress would fail again, and materials exposed to prolonged vacuum embrittlement were statistically unsalvageable. The equations carried no malice, only probability. Tens of millions of inhabitants registered as a tragic but acceptable loss within galactic norms, a rounding error against the preservation of stability. Stability demanded abandonment, and abandonment was rendered humane by speed. Envoys recorded their consensus with steady appendages, the faint ozone scent of active hollow projectors filling the chamber. Their sensory arrays filtered out the planet's distress beacons as noise, the way one ignores the hiss of cosmic background radiation. They calculated how quickly the system would be cordoned, how long debris fields would remain hazardous, how soon memory would thin into footnotes. The rings of the gas giant rolled beneath them in stately silence, and the shards of the elevator continued their cold ballet, ticking against each other with sounds too faint to matter. By the time the final authorization sealed, the decision had already aged into history. The Council turned its attention outward, toward cleaner problems and cooperative horizons, leaving behind a world measured, weighed, and found inefficient. In the ledger of the galaxy, the entry was complete, the sum resolved, and the void waited patiently to finish the work. Evacuation fleets assembled along prescribed vectors, their drives humming in layered harmonics that carried through vacuum as electromagnetic tremors. To the observers from neighboring species, the formation was almost ceremonial, a rite perfected over millennia of orderly retreat. Ships slid into alignment with measured distances between hulls, exhaust plumes diffused to non-lethal gradients, and command signals propagated with metronomic calm. This was how a doomed system was closed, cleanly and without drama. Below them, the shattered spine of the orbital elevator glittered against the dark. It stretched from the planet's upper cloud decks into the endless black like a frozen scream, its once seamless surface now fractured into jagged segments locked in slow, lethal rotation. Ice crystals sublimated from torn conduits and flashed briefly as they caught distant starlight, then vanished into nothing. The debris field sang to itself in faint metallic clicks as fragments brushed past one another, each contact shaving away another molecule of structural integrity. Sensors painted a picture no species disputed. Temperature gradients shifted violently from searing radiance to killing cold within the span of a heartbeat. Radiation storms rolled through the corridor like invisible surf, stripping unshielded circuitry down to inert slag. Structural torsion twisted the remaining sections of the elevator beyond all safety tolerances, beyond even theoretical compensation. The data streams agreed in ruthless harmony. No rational species would attempt repairs. No doctrine allowed it. The machine was dead, and dead machines were not mourned. The observers felt no satisfaction, only the quiet assurance of correctness. Their histories were built on survival through restraint, through learning when to let go. Worlds had been lost before and would be lost again, each one a lesson in limits. The evacuation fleets represented mercy, the swift extraction of what could still be saved. Anything else was waste. Then new signals intruded on the net. Human vessels emerged from translation far closer to the debris field than recommended by any safety charter. Their arrival was abrupt, almost rude, drives flaring hot and loud before throttling down into a controlled drift amid spinning wreckage. They were fewer than the evacuation armadas, smaller in mass and profile, their hulls scarred by prior service rather than polished for ceremonial withdrawal. Their proximity triggered warning cascades across alien consoles, alarms translated into pulses of color and vibration. Council analysts flagged the maneuver as a probable misunderstanding. Perhaps the humans had misread the evacuation timetable. Perhaps they were late arrivals, racing to load their share of refugees before quarantine seals snapped shut. The assumption settled easily because it aligned with every precedent. When a system was lost, one either fled or perished. There was no third path. Yet the human ships did not orient toward population centers. Their cargo bays remained sealed. No shuttles descended toward the atmosphere. Instead, mechanical frames unfolded from their flanks, angular skeletons of truss and brace that locked together with visible force. Welding drones spilled outward in coordinated swarms, their arc emitters crackling blue, white even before contact. Pressurized coffins followed, blunt cylinders barely large enough to contain a single human body, their surfaces already frosting as they bled heat into space. Confusion rippled through the alien observers like static through a choir. Sensor arrays reoriented, struggling to classify what they were seeing. The humans were not rescuing. They were not retreating. They were approaching the corpse. The situation, from every other perspective, had already been solved. The solution was departure. Human vessels threaded themselves through the debris field with unsettling confidence. They did not clear every fragment, instead nudging some aside, anchoring others, treating the spinning wreckage as something to be grasped rather than avoided. The observers registered near misses that should have been catastrophic, hulls skimming past jagged alloy by margins measured in hand spans. Each pass sent shockwaves through alien neural clusters attuned to risk. The humans appeared indifferent. Radiation storms washed over the construction frames, and the drones compensated with brute redundancy, units failing and being replaced without ceremony. Thermal sensors flared as welders bit into frozen metal, creating violent plumes of vapor that expanded and vanished in the same breath. The soundless violence of it all translated into furious data spikes, a storm of readings that contradicted every expectation of orderly behavior. Analytical subroutines searched for rationale. Perhaps this was a symbolic act, a cultural gesture marking loss. Perhaps it was training, an exercise conducted in extremis to gather data for future designs. Yet the resource expenditure made no sense. Materials were being committed where no return was predicted. Time was being spent where time was the one thing evacuation doctrine forbade wasting. The observers noted something else, more troubling. Human activity clustered not at the most intact sections of the elevator, but at its most damaged joints, the places where structural failure was most absolute. They worked where theory said nothing could be salvaged. They anchored frames across gaps too wide for standard reinforcement, layering mass upon mass, building ugly, asymmetrical growths that offended aesthetic and engineering sensibilities alike. Alien sensors tasted the atmosphere of the moment, metaphorically speaking, and found it thick with contradiction. There was no sign of panic among the humans, no frantic acceleration typical of desperate rescues. Their movements were deliberate, almost stubborn. They behaved as though time itself could be argued with, as though inevitability were a suggestion rather than a law. Evacuation fleets continued to depart, their drives fading into distant harmonics as they slipped towards safer corridors. Fewer observers remained now, curiosity overriding doctrine. They watched the humans tether themselves to spinning debris and deploy the coffins, each one locking onto a frame before opening to receive a single figure. Suits gleamed dully as humans exited, their silhouettes small against the vast machinery, heat plumes blooming briefly around them before dispersing. Every metric screamed impossibility. Unshielded exposure durations exceeded survivable limits. Mechanical stress threatened cascade collapse. Radiation dosages climbed into ranges labeled fatal in every database. Still the humans persisted, welding arcs flashing like silent lightning, their coffins repositioning again and again to keep them alive for moments longer. The observers felt something new seep into their calculations, an error term they could not isolate. This was not bravery as other species defined it, the calculated risk taken for proportional gain. This was not madness either, though it resembled it. It was a refusal to accept the premise that abandonment was the only rational choice. As the last evacuation ships vanished, leaving the system thin and quiet, the humans remained. Their ships drifted amid the wreckage, lights burning steadily, construction frames locked in place like ribs around a broken spine. The debris field no longer looked like a corpse being left behind. It looked, disturbingly, like a patient surrounded by caregivers who had no intention of stepping away. For the observers, trained by history to equate survival with withdrawal, the sight was profoundly unsettling. The galaxy had taught them that some losses were necessary. Humanity, it seemed, had learned a different lesson entirely. Humanity approached the broken elevator as one would approach a living thing in pain. The structure was not catalogued as debris, but sensed as a body bearing stress, fatigue, and shock. Human engineers pressed gloved hands against fractured girders and listened through bone-conducting sensors to the low tremor of strained metal. They felt vibrations ripple through their arms, patterns too chaotic for distant models, yet intimate enough to reveal where the structure still wanted to hold together. Data mattered, but touch mattered more. They anchored themselves to spinning wreckage with magnetic clamps and braided tethers, letting their bodies absorb motion that would have shattered rigid frames. The elevator's remnants rotated slowly but relentlessly, each section carrying its own stubborn momentum. Humans matched that motion rather than fighting it, timing their movements to the groan of stressed joints and the faint ticking of microfractures propagating through alloy. Cutting torches flared in vacuum, their light harsh and surgical, slicing away twisted sections that threatened to tear free. Where calculations predicted catastrophic heat loss and brittle failure, human welders leaned in and fused metal anyway, layering passes until the joint glowed dull and heavy. Vacuum screamed against their suits, not as sound, but as pressure loss alarms translated into visceral vibration. Ice crystals formed instantly around exposed conduits, then detonated into glittering shrapnel when struck by thermal gradients. The fragments pinged against helmets and chest plates, a hail of sharp impacts that rattled teeth and blurred vision. Emergency thrusters fired in short, violent bursts, overcorrecting against spin and recoil. Many burned out within minutes, their housings warped and useless. Humans compensated with muscle and grip, hauling themselves along handholds never meant to exist, fingers aching as they clamped onto roughened metal scored by previous failures. From the Council's distant vantage, the operation degraded into a cascading nightmare. Probability curves collapsed into saturated red bands across observation matrices. Every additional hour multiplied risk vectors, suit rupture from micrometeoroid impact, radiation exposure exceeding lethal thresholds, structural collapse propagating through newly stressed sections. The models predicted failure not as a possibility, but as an approaching certainty. The correct response, by every established doctrine, was immediate withdrawal. The humans did not withdraw. They moved slower than automated systems, slower even than drones that flickered and died in radiation storms. Their pace was deliberate, constrained by exhaustion and by the simple fact of working with their own bodies in an environment that punished flesh. Yet they refused to stop. When one section stabilized, they shifted to the next without ceremony. When a reinforcement warped under unexpected load, they added another layer, and then another, bolting mass onto mass until elegance gave way to brute persistence. Their engineering did not seek optimization. It sought assurance. Redundancies multiplied not because models demanded them, but because the idea of leaving a weakness unaddressed felt intolerable. Where a single brace would have sufficed on paper, humans installed 3, then bound them together with composite wraps and adhesive foams that cured poorly in vacuum, but added friction and drag. The structure grew asymmetrical, heavy in places, ugly by any aesthetic metric. It also grew stubborn. Council observers registered an anomaly in the stress distribution graphs. Load paths began to diffuse rather than concentrate, energy bleeding sideways into layers never designed to bear it. The elevator was no longer behaving like its original blueprint. It was becoming something else, a patchwork organism reinforced by scar tissue. Humans did not restore the elevator as it had been. They changed it. Radiation storms swept through, invisible and lethal. Human suits absorbed dose after dose, shielding groaning under accumulated damage. Medical telemetry spiked into danger ranges and stayed there. Some humans lost fine motor control, hands shaking as nerve conduction faltered. They compensated by locking joints and using gross movements, trading precision for force. When vision blurred from cosmic ray strikes, they relied on tactile markers welded into place moments earlier. Every adaptation was immediate, improvised, and shared across the team through gesture and prearranged signals. Debris struck with sudden violence. A fragment the size of a fist punched through a construction frame, tearing metal and sending it spinning. Humans reeled with it, tethers snapping taut, bodies swinging wide arcs through open space. They arrested their motion inches from jagged edges, the recoil transmitting through shoulders and spines. Pain registered, then was set aside. The work continued. From orbit, the elevator's profile shifted subtly. Sections once separated by void now bridged by crude lattices. Gaps filled with interlocking plates and tension cables. Thermal signatures stabilized where chaos had reigned, the wild oscillations dampened by sheer mass and friction. It was not safe by any council definition. It was merely less unstable than before. Hours stretched into something amorphous, measured not by clocks, but by oxygen consumption and battery depletion. Human vessels rotated crews through pressurized coffins, each coffin docking, opening, closing with a dull thud that resonated through the frames. Bodies emerged pale and shaking, then returned to the wreckage as soon as vital signs permitted. Rest was rationed, taken in fragments measured by necessity rather than comfort. Council analysts updated their projections repeatedly, each revision more alarming than the last. Failure remained inevitable within all acceptable confidence intervals. And yet, the actual structure stubbornly refused to comply. Stress did not propagate as predicted. Fractures arrested where reinforcements intersected at awkward angles. Vibrations dampened instead of amplifying. The elevator endured, not gracefully, but with the obstinate endurance of something held together by will. Observers began to notice a pattern the models could not encode. Humans clustered their efforts around transitions, the places where one failure would doom everything downstream. They reinforced not just the obvious breaks, but the subtle points of handoff, the joints where load, motion, and heat exchanged authority. It was an approach born less of theory than of lived experience with systems that failed catastrophically when neglected. They had seen bridges fall, ships break apart, bodies give way. They treated the elevator accordingly. As the operation dragged on, The council's certainty eroded into something like unease. The humans were not winning against probability, but they were delaying it, bending it, forcing it to renegotiate terms. The galaxy had taught that some problems had no solutions, only mitigations. Humanity behaved as though mitigation were simply the first step. By the end of that cycle, the elevator no longer screamed in the data. It groaned, strained, and shuddered, but it held. The humans clung to it, silhouetted against stars, small figures against a massive, wounded construct. They had not resurrected the dead. They had refused to accept death as final. In doing so, they began to teach the galaxy a lesson it was deeply uncomfortable learning. Refusal became the defining force long before stabilization registered on any council display. It manifested first as a rejection of subtraction. When simulations screamed that mass must be reduced to prevent collapse, humans dragged additional girders into place instead. They bolted, clamped, and welded weight onto a structure already straining under its own burden. The elevator groaned as if protesting, metal fibers singing in low, tortured harmonics. Yet the added mass dampened wild oscillations and absorbed shocks that would have ripped lighter frameworks apart. Where elegance demanded slimming, humanity answered with thickness. Torque built as orbital mechanics continued their indifferent dance. Rotational forces twisted the elevator's spine beyond certified tolerances, beyond any margin the council had ever allowed. Humans responded by redistributing stress manually. They bound sections together with layered alloys never designed to touch. Composites scavenged from cargo hulls, engine housings, and obsolete armor plates. Each layer carried a different response to heat and strain, and together they argued against failure through sheer disagreement. The bindings looked wrong, asymmetrical and crude, but they spread force sideways, bleeding it into paths no equation had predicted. Welding arcs flared again and again in open vacuum, violating the tidy assumptions of heat transfer taught in every civilized academy. Human welders compensated instinctively, adjusting distance and duration by feel, by the color of molten metal and the way it cooled too fast or not fast enough. These techniques had not been born in classrooms, but in shipyards hammered together during wars humanity barely remembered wanting to survive. Desperation had taught them that theory bent under pressure, and that sometimes pressure was the only teacher that mattered. Each action offended the council's sense of order. The structure grew heavier, uglier, and more resilient with every hour. Reinforcements overlapped, intersected, and interfered with one another in ways no clean blueprint would allow. Instead of clean load paths, there were tangled webs of support. Instead of minimal tolerance, there was excess, layered and unapologetic. The elevator stopped behaving like a machine and began behaving like a barricade. Alien sensors drank in the cost. Human heart rates spiked far beyond safe thresholds and remained there, pounding against ribs with the insistence of something that refused to slow. Metabolic exhaustion crept through muscle tissue, lactic acid pooling as bodies burned reserves meant to last far longer. Radiation exposure climbed steadily, invisible particles punching through suit shielding and into flesh. Dosimeters ticked past lines marked lethal in every shared database. Medical craft hovered nearby, their hulls white and clean against the chaos, bays stocked and ready. They remained unused. Humans cycled through pressurized coffins only when collapse loomed, taking just enough oxygen and fluids to stand again before returning to the wreckage. Their movements grew heavier, less precise, but no less determined. Every delay translated in their minds into another city dimming below, another reactor edging closer to failure, another population inhaling air that tasted increasingly of desperation. The alternative to persistence was visible beneath them. The planet turned slowly, its atmosphere smeared with the faint haze of industrial runoff and emergency venting. Night-side cities flickered unevenly, power grids stuttering as orbital supply lines remained severed. Thermal blooms marked failing infrastructure like bruises on skin. Humans did not need projections to understand what abandonment meant. They had lived versions of it before, on worlds where help had arrived too late or not at all. The elevator's spine began to respond. Not dramatically, not with triumphant alignment, but with subtle changes that only constant attention revealed. Vibrations dampened from wild shudders into slower, deeper pulses. Stress readings flattened where reinforcements intersected, peaks blunted by mass and friction. Fractures that should have propagated stalled against layered bindings and ugly welds. The structure did not heal, but it stopped bleeding. Council equations objected. Predictive models recalculated again and again, each iteration insisting collapse remained inevitable. Yet real-time telemetry contradicted them with stubborn consistency. Stability, partial and precarious, asserted itself where none should exist. The elevator endured not because equations approved, but because every failure point had been overbuilt by hands that refused to accept loss as reasonable. Human bodies paid for that refusal in increments too small to dramatize individually. Skin blistered beneath suit linings where radiation interacted with sweat and fabric. Joints swelled from repeated strain, microtears accumulating into persistent pain. Vision blurred intermittently as cosmic rays disrupted neural signaling. Each symptom was logged, acknowledged, and set aside. Pain became background noise, another parameter to manage alongside oxygen levels and weld integrity. Observers from the council began to notice behavioral patterns that defied their own doctrines. Humans prioritized transitions and interfaces, the places where one system handed responsibility to another. They reinforced joints not because they were the weakest points on paper, but because experience had taught them that failure loved edges. They overbuilt those edges mercilessly. Where a single support might suffice, they installed 3, then braced those supports against one another, creating redundancy upon redundancy until failure would have to argue its way through layers of stubborn resistance. Time lost its conventional meaning. There were no neat cycles, only phases marked by supply rotations and suit endurance limits. Human vessels adjusted their orbits constantly, thrusters firing in short, corrective bursts to maintain alignment with the slowly stabilizing structure. Fuel consumption spiked, and contingency reserves dwindled. Still the work continued. Withdrawal options remained available, flagged in every system. They were never selected. As stabilization increased, the elevator began to transmit forces downward again, faint at first. Micro-adjustments rippled along its length, signals that something resembling continuity had been restored. The planet responded. Power flows evened out as orbital platforms regained partial access. Supply caches once trapped above atmosphere inched closer to usefulness. Cities did not yet breathe freely, but they no longer choked as quickly. The council watched, unsettled. Their frameworks had no place for this outcome. They had assumed that rational actors abandoned unsalvageable systems to preserve the greater whole. Humanity appeared to operate under a different axiom entirely. For them, the greater whole included the unsalvageable, at least until every alternative was truly exhausted. By the time the elevator's motion slowed into something approaching equilibrium, the human presence along its spine looked less like a repair crew and more like a graft. They had fused themselves into the structure through effort, injury, and refusal. The elevator stood not because it had been repaired according to doctrine, but because it had been forced to endure by a species that treated surrender as the most unacceptable failure of all. In that moment, as the data reluctantly stabilized and the planet below flickered toward fragile recovery, the galaxy learned something it would spend generations trying to rationalize. Humanity did not save the elevator by being smarter than everyone else. They saved it by being unwilling to walk away, even when every calculation insisted that walking away was the only sensible choice. Silence fell when the final connection locked into place, not the absence of sound, but the sudden removal of chaos. The elevator hung between planet and sky like a wounded artery sutured by trembling hands, scarred with overlapping plates and swollen welds that caught starlight in uneven scars. Its alignment was imperfect by every formal metric. Micro-vibrations rippled through its length, a low, continuous hum that never quite settled. Frost drifted from shaded surfaces, sublimating into faint clouds that glittered and vanished. It was not beautiful. It was not clean. It was alive. Council instruments reacted with hostility. Predictive arrays recalculated in rapid cycles, confidence intervals collapsing into increasingly narrow windows of inevitable failure. Structural models insisted that accumulated mass should induce progressive collapse. Thermal projections warned of uneven expansion tearing the spine apart. Time to catastrophic failure was revised downward again and again, measured now in minutes rather than hours. Automated advisories prepared evacuation notices that no longer had anyone left to send them to. Instead of collapse, the elevator endured. The first cargo pods moved with exaggerated caution, their clamps engaging softly, their ascent barely perceptible against the planet's curve. Motors whined at reduced output, as if afraid of startling the structure. The pods reached the first transfer node and did not fall. They continued upward, then downward, tracing the same scarred path that had moments ago been declared a death sentence. Sensors along the spine registered load and strain and did not scream. They whispered, uncertain but present. Power followed. Lines long dormant warmed as currents surged upward, uneven at first, then steadier as regulators adjusted to the new, ugly reality of the system. Lights on orbital platforms brightened from emergency amber to functional white. Reactors below adjusted their outputs, no longer forced to cannibalize themselves to meet impossible demands. The planet exhaled through 1,000 small stabilizations rather than one dramatic miracle. Supplies flowed downward in return. Medical crates, filtration units, structural polymers, and food reserves descended through the repaired artery. Atmospheric processors that had been running on borrowed time stabilized. Water reclamation plants eased their rationing protocols. Cities that had been balancing on the edge of darkness found their margins widened by precious degrees. Nothing was fixed. Everything was survivable. Shock rippled through the observing fleets in patterns their own analysts would later struggle to describe. Sensor crews recalibrated instruments, convinced that error must be present. Independent platforms cross-checked readings and found them stubbornly consistent. A structure declared irreparable by the greatest minds of the Council was functioning, not at optimal efficiency, not within prescribed tolerances, but at sufficient mercy. The phrase began circulating in translated reports almost by accident. Sufficient mercy. It described a system that did not punish its occupants for existing, a structure that accepted imperfection as the cost of continuation. It unsettled doctrines built on optimization and replacement. It suggested that survival did not always require elegance, only endurance. The humans did not mark the moment with ceremony. There were no signals broadcast, no declarations issued. Along the spine of the elevator, figures clung where they had last worked, magnetic boots locked, harnesses taut. Exhaustion overtook them with the inevitability of gravity reclaimed. Muscles that had been held tight for days released all at once, trembling uncontrollably. Hands stiffened around tools they no longer needed. Some bodies slumped against the structure, helmets resting on cold alloy, breath fogging visors from the inside. Suits were scarred and frostbitten, insulation scorched in places by welding arcs that had flared too close. Ice filmed over seams where heat had met vacuum too abruptly. Visors bore streaks of frozen condensation, obscuring faces that would later show burns, bruises, and the slow bloom of radiation sickness. In that moment, they slept anyway, suspended between sky and world, trusting the ugly thing they had made to hold. Medical craft moved closer at last, not in alarm but in quiet acknowledgement. Recovery teams prepared for a harvest of injuries rather than casualties. Radiation exposure logs would later horrify Council physicians, numbers that crossed thresholds considered incompatible with continued function. Human physiology absorbed the data with indifference, registering harm but prioritizing rest. Bodies that had been driven beyond safe limits demanded their due. The elevator continued to hum. Time passed without catastrophe, first in cautious increments, then in stretches long enough to force a reevaluation of assumptions. Minutes became hours. Hours bled into cycles marked only by the planet's slow rotation beneath. With each completed cycle, the probability of immediate failure decreased, not because damage had vanished, but because the structure had proven capable of redistributing stress through its layered stubbornness. Failure points that should have cascaded remained isolated. Their energy bled away into redundant paths hammered into existence by refusal. Council observers began to understand the nature of the error they had made. They had evaluated the elevator as a finished product, a machine whose worth was defined by adherence to design. Humanity had treated it as a relationship, something that could be argued with, reinforced, compromised with, and kept alive through constant attention. The structure functioned not because it met criteria, but because someone was willing to stay with it through its worst moments. On the planet below, people did not yet celebrate either. They noticed changes in small ways. Air tasted less stale. Lights stayed on through what should have been brownouts. Transport schedules shifted from emergency improvisation to rough reliability. Children slept without the background tremor of failing infrastructure vibrating through walls. Adults allowed themselves the dangerous luxury of planning more than a day ahead. Data streams recorded these effects dispassionately. Historians would later annotate them with context and meaning. In the moment, they were simply relief made tangible. The Council's quarantine protocol stalled. Automated systems flagged the system as anomalous, no longer fitting categories of abandonment or stabilization. Committees delayed decisions, waiting for failure that refused to arrive on schedule. For the first time in generations, Council logic encountered an outcome that did not collapse neatly into precedent. Above the planet, the elevator remained an affront to aesthetics and expectation. Its silhouette against the stars was jagged and asymmetrical, a spine reinforced with scars. It caught light in ways that revealed every compromise and every refusal. It did not pretend to be perfect. It did not apologize for surviving. The humans who had built mercy into its frame recovered slowly. Some would never fully recover. Medical assessments would recommend long-term care, reduced exposure, and rest that could never truly repay the debt incurred. They accepted these outcomes with the same quiet practicality they had brought to the repair. Consequences were acknowledged, not dramatized. When records of the event were finally compiled, analysts struggled to identify the moment that had made the difference. There was no single weld, no decisive calculation. The turning point was absence itself, the absence of abandonment, the absence of retreat, the absence of the quiet, rational step away that the galaxy had long considered wisdom. The elevator held, and in doing so it forced the galaxy to confront an uncomfortable truth. Humanity had not saved the planet by transcending physical law. They had saved it by refusing to treat loss as an acceptable variable. Their triumph lay not in defiance shouted to the stars, but in the quiet, almost embarrassed persistence of bodies clinging to cold metal until mercy, however imperfect, took hold. Revision began quietly, as most fundamental shifts do, with annotations rather than proclamations. In the crystalline chambers where the Council archived its certainties, clerks and analysts appended cautious footnotes to doctrines once considered immutable. Margins filled with qualifiers about human unpredictability, about engineering decisions driven not by statistical comfort, but by moral pressure intense enough to warp probability itself. The orbital elevator, once sealed inside a file-marked terminal, was reopened, dissected, and cross-referenced until it ceased to be an anomaly and became a precedent. The case study grew heavy with addenda. Charts of material fatigue sat beside recordings of human biometrics captured during the repair, heart rates sustained at levels deemed unsustainable, neural activity patterns consistent with extreme stress, yet paired with continued precision. Models attempted to reconcile these contradictions and failed. The elevator resisted reduction into clean variables. It stood as evidence that some forces entered the equation from outside physics, pressures applied not by gravity or torque, but by refusal. In time, the elevator was no longer discussed as a success. It was discussed as a warning. Council instructors used it to caution junior strategists against assuming rational retreat as a universal constant. They emphasized that some species would not accept the universe's indifference as final. Such species did not negotiate with entropy. They argued with it, hammering meaning into cold metal until it held together out of stubborn compliance. The lesson unsettled long-standing hierarchies of decision-making, where abandonment had always been framed as wisdom rather than surrender. The structure itself endured as a visible scar against the stars. Its silhouette never smoothed into elegance. Repairs remained evident, layers of reinforcement catching light at odd angles, seams thick with welds that had never been polished for display. Maintenance crews reported that the elevator responded best to constant attention, to incremental reinforcement rather than grand overhauls. It behaved less like infrastructure and more like a living compromise, demanding presence as much as precision. On the planet below, survival unfolded without fanfare. Power grids stabilized into predictable rhythms. Supply chains reconnected, their flows uneven but persistent. Cities resumed patterns of life interrupted rather than erased. People remembered the weeks of near collapse as a pressure behind the eyes, a constant background dread that faded slowly rather than disappearing all at once. When the memory dulled enough to allow reflection, gratitude did not always find words. It settled instead into habits, into maintenance budgets approved with fewer objections, into an instinctive mistrust of any plan that began with the phrase acceptable loss. Humans returned to the elevator regularly, not because failure was imminent, but because absence felt irresponsible. They inspected welds by hand, listening to vibrations transmitted through gloves and bone. They added reinforcements where instinct suggested future weakness, not waiting for instruments to demand action. Their presence became part of the system's stability, an unquantified but undeniable factor. The Council observed these practices with a mixture of fascination and unease. Attempts to codify them into transferable doctrine faltered. Other species could replicate the materials, the techniques, even the redundancies. What they could not replicate was the impetus. Moral necessity resisted translation into policy language. Empathy, sharpened into resolve, did not fit neatly into predictive frameworks. As the months passed, quarantine protocols were quietly retired. Trade lanes reopened. Observing fleets departed, leaving behind long-range sensors and unresolved questions. The system re-entered the galaxy's circulation, altered not only by survival, but by reputation. It became known as a place humanity had refused to lose, and that knowledge carried weight disproportionate to the system's economic value. Council records from this period reveal a subtle shift in tone. Phrases like optimal outcome gave way to survivable outcome. Calculations began to include variables previously dismissed as noise: attachment, obligation, the psychological cost of withdrawal. Analysts noted, with professional discomfort, that models incorporating these factors produced results closer to observed reality when humans were involved. The elevator's file grew thick with cross-disciplinary citations. Engineering treatises referenced sociological impact assessments. Strategic manuals quoted medical ethics debates. The structure had forced silos of knowledge to collapse into one another, much as its own layered reinforcements had done under stress. Understanding it required accepting that function could emerge from principles considered unscientific. The planet's survival was eventually summarized in council briefings with a clarity that bordered on resignation. It had not been efficient to save it. Evacuation would have cost fewer ships, fewer resources, fewer long-term complications. By every metric the council valued, abandonment had been the correct choice. That correctness had simply failed to matter to the species that arrived with welding torches instead of transport manifests. Humanity had decided the planet must not be lost, and that decision had altered the local shape of reality. The stars had adjusted around it. Orbital mechanics accommodating reinforced mass, trade networks rerouting to support a system that should have been written off. Cause followed resolve rather than the other way around. This understanding unsettled the galaxy more than any display of technological superiority could have. It implied that humanity did not merely react to the universe, they negotiated with it. They treated indifference as a challenge rather than a verdict. When faced with the choice between abandonment and impossible labor, they chose the latter with such consistency that impossibility itself appeared negotiable. Future encounters would be colored by this lesson. Council strategists flagged human involvement as a destabilizing factor in projections, capable of skewing outcomes through sheer persistence. Allies approached them with a mixture of hope and apprehension, aware that accepting human help meant accepting solutions that would hurt, endure, and refuse to fail quietly. Adversaries, wiser than they wished to be, learned that cornering humanity did not produce surrender, but escalation of effort beyond rational bounds. The elevator continued to function, imperfect and stubborn, long after the event faded into recorded history. Its hum became part of the planet's soundscape, a low reminder that survival had been argued into existence. Travelers who ascended its length felt the vibration through their boots, a physical echo of the labor embedded in every segment. In later years, when council philosophers debated the nature of meaning in an indifferent universe, the elevator was cited not as metaphor, but as evidence. Meaning, they concluded with reluctance, could be imposed. It could be welded, bolted, and reinforced until it held under stress. Humanity exemplified this principle with uncomfortable clarity. They built not solely by calculation, though they were capable of it. They built by necessity, by empathy sharpened into resolve, by the unwillingness to accept that some losses were simply reasonable. In doing so, they forced the galaxy to expand its understanding of what was possible. The stars did not applaud this revelation. They remained cold and distant, burning on in silence. Yet around one scarred elevator and one stubborn world, their patterns bent just enough to accommodate a decision that should never have worked. And in that quiet adjustment lay the truth the Council would never fully domesticate, that when humanity chose to build, the universe was often compelled, however reluctantly, to let them.